Speaker. This morning, the Minister said he was unaware of his government's education funding record over the past 7 years and asked me to provide him with information that explains how the Conservative government has cut funding while they've been in power, so I'm happy to do that. I do have to say that it's quite shocking that the Premier would have named a Minister of Education who does not understand education funding, or at least that the Minister hasn't been sufficiently briefed by his ministry before tabling next year's education funding, but I know it's been a revolving door over there for education ministers, 4 in the past 11 months, so maybe it's hard to be up to speed on that file. But you know, this really matters, Speaker, because we're talking about the well-being of our kids here. Their access to a high-quality education, access to mental health care, special education supports, safe and healthy schools, and safe and reliable student transportation. So I'm going to do my best to educate the Minister of Education this evening, Speaker, so that he can understand education funding and how it is we've ended up with $6.35 billion out of the education system under his government. And to start, I need to explain some key concepts to the Minister. I think this is a government that requires some financial literacy classes, Speaker, but here's a crash course for the Minister. So let's start with inflation. Here's how TD Bank defines inflation. Inflation is the rising price of goods and services associated with the cost of living. Inflation means that the purchasing power of money decreases and more units of currency are required to buy the same goods and services that previously cost less. The key thing here, Speaker, is that over time the same amount of money is worth less. You can't pay for the same number of staff or buy a school bus or build a new school for the same amount of money. The second concept I need to explain to the Minister is population growth. Encyclopedia Britannica defines population growth as, quote, a change in the number of members of a certain plant or animal species in a particular location during a particular time period. So in this case, we're talking about children, and the particular location is the education system, and the particular time is a school year. And as the Financial Accountability Officer explains, population growth, quote, drives up the demand for public services. So as the number of students grows, we need to provide education to more kids. So when your funding isn't keeping up with inflation or student enrollment, then each dollar you put towards the education system pays for fewer educators, fewer programs, fewer schools, and each child added to the system means that pot of money has to be divided between more children. So now that the Minister has a basic foundational understanding of how budgets work, let's look at the Conservative government's funding. Overall, Speaker, since 2018, when this government came to power, if we look at per-student funding to account for increasing enrollment, per-student funding has grown 18%. But inflation, Speaker, is up 23%. Hopefully the Minister can do basic math and understands that 23 is bigger than 18. Now let's look year by year. In 2019-20, inflation and enrollment growth added to 1.5%, while funding rose by only 0.5%, resulting in a funding gap of $250 million. In 2021, inflation and enrollment growth added to 0.8%, while funding rose by only 0.6%, resulting in a funding gap of $285 million. In 2021-22, inflation and enrollment growth added to 7.4%, while funding rose by only 2.4%, resulting in a funding gap of $1.5 million. In 2022-23, inflation and enrollment growth added to 5.7%, while funding rose by only 3%, resulting in a funding gap of $2 billion. In 2023-24, inflation and enrollment growth added to 3.8%, while funding rose by 8.2%, but by now we were so far behind 2018 levels that we had a funding gap of $900 million. In 2024-25, inflation and enrollment growth added up to 3.1%, while funding rose 4%, but again, so far behind 2018 that we still had a funding gap of $700 million. For 2025-26, inflation and enrollment growth are forecast to be a total of 2.6%, while funding is increasing by 3.3%, but again, we are so far behind 2018-2019 funding levels that the funding gap is growing by another $560 million. The cumulative funding gap for this entire period is $6.35 billion. That's how much this government has shortchanged school boards and our kids over this entire period. I hope this clears things up for the Minister, Speaker, and I'm happy to answer any questions he might still have.